everybody. Good morning to those of you guys that are joining us from the US, and a good evening to those of you guys based in China. Welcome. My name is Devin Lau. I'm the Assistant Director of Yale Center Beijing. And we have today, very lucky to have Professor Emily Erikson join us for her talk. Before we get started, I'll just give a quick introduction. For those of you guys that are new to Yale Center Beijing, we are Yale's only university-wide center based out of New Haven. And of course, with the pandemic, where we haven't been able to do much traveling and hosting of Yale professors in person, we've been doing a lot of activities online. And so luckily, that's been allowed for a lot of you guys to join us. And we've had across the faculty from drama to music to economics to biology, medicine, and all sorts of different topics. Today we have a topic that obviously is of interest to everybody that's joining us here today. Professor Emily Erikson is the Joseph C. Fox Academic Director of the Yale Fox International Fellowship, as well as Associate Professor of Sociology, and also at the School of Management by courtesy. Her research is in the fields of social networks, comparative historical sociology, organizations, theory, and economic sociology. Her book today that we'll be discussing is Trade and Nation, How Companies and Politics Reshaped Economic Thought. And she's also written Between Monopoly and Free Trade, a book focusing on the English East India Company. Professor Erikson is the chair of the American Sociological Association's Economic Sociology section, as well as serving on the Executive Council for the Society for the Advancement of Socioeconomics and the editorial board of Social Science History and Sociological Theory. Her work has appeared in many journals, and we are very lucky to have her join us today. I know that we were supposed to have this event about a month ago, but unfortunately we had to reschedule at the last minute. And the reason is because Professor Erikson actually suffered from a skiing accident about a month ago and actually punctured her lungs. And so she hasn't been able to do any lectures for about a month, but she has very quickly recovered to enough of an extent that she's happy to join us today. To give her a bit of a break because she is still recuperating, I've actually asked her to first record her remarks for today, which she will introduce and play, and then we'll go into a live Q&A after that. I know that a lot of you guys have been watching the Winter Olympics, and you've seen just how gnarly some of these crashes and accidents can be on the slopes with skiing and snowboarding and things like that. So we are very lucky to have Professor Erikson, and we're glad that she's okay. And we're extremely honored that she is still willing to make the time and effort to join us today. And so with that, I will turn it over to Professor Erikson.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I don't want to repeat what I'm going to say in the little presentation. So I'll just start that now. Let's see, I'm going to share my screen. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very sorry that I can't actually be there in person, but maybe at some point in the future, that would be wonderful. So today I'm presenting work that is currently out in the United States and in Europe, Trade and Nation, How Companies and Politics Reshape the Economic Thought. It's with Columbia University Press. I'm happy to announce that a Chinese translation will be available either at the end of the year or next year with Shanghai People's Press. So hopefully, if you're interested and enjoyed the talk, maybe you can look for that translation or pick up the English version in the meantime. So what I want to do is I'm talking about a sort of a transition that occurred in economic thought in the 16th century, 17th century. So I want to just begin by reading a couple of passages that'll give you a sense of the shift that took place. So the first passage is from an extremely popular economic tract. Here, it was more indicative of what would be on. Now, this is a good question. Is that going to be the left or the right side? In any case, it's the side with a picture for you. I'm not sure how it'll come out on your end. But so the short passage here is from the medieval era. At midsummer down with the brambles and brakes, and after abroad with thy forks and thy rakes, that movers a mowing where meadow is grown, the longer standing, the worse to be mown. So that's from Thomas Tusser, who is the author of a very popular book then called 500 Points of Good Husbandry. It was full of advice on farming, gardening, and herding. It may seem sort of homely now, but it's descended from a lineage of economic thinkers that dates back to Xenophon and the Aristotelian version of economics. Essentially home economics, how to make your house and home more productive, your home garden. It was one of two strands of medieval economic thought that was popular among medieval scholars. Here's a passage from the second strand. This passage is from a work that quotes liberally from Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Why should the Holy Ghost twice mention these expressions? If the brother be poor, thou shalt lend without usury. This is from Thomas Wilson's A Discourse Against Usury, which was part of a larger body of heavily religious works condemning money and commerce as evil and usury as sin. These included works concerning the problem of a just price, an act of exchange that will not penalize one of the partners in the exchange. And there was no real call for equality in these works, but there was a strong sense of responsibility towards others, and especially towards the poor. Now let me read a passage from 1692. Trade then is necessary to the producing of riches and money, necessary to the carrying on of trade, and the reducing of money to 4%, which will discourage men from lending, will be a loss to the kingdom in stopping so much of the current of money which turns the wheels of trade. This is from John Locke's essay, Some Considerations on the Consequences of Lowering the Interest and Raising the Value of Money. Here, trade is seen as an unalloyed good, and the increase of trade enriches the kingdom and nation. Trade and commerce are understood to obey their own laws, and reason and experience can be applied to ferret out what those laws are. So those are just examples, but the whole of economic thought here, hopefully you can see how significant the difference is between these first passages and this later passage. What was once personal and moral became national, abstract,
Emily, can you put the screen on full screen?
And in their exploration and formulation of rules governing commerce and species flow, the economic thinkers of the New Age, people like John Locke, Thomas Munn, Josiah Child, and Charles Davenant, laid the empirical and scientific groundwork for Adam Smith's formulation of classical economics. In short, it was a sort of a revolution in thought, one that left concerns for fairness and equity by the wayside in favor of theories of national economic development and growth. One of the most remarkable things about this shift is that it occurred in England. It was picked up elsewhere, but really the original change only took place in England. So I haven't been able to find comparable approaches in Asia, although I've looked, but I'm very open. If anyone has any suggestions, that would be really wonderful. It would be terrific to get a better sense of that. But in Europe, there certainly was nothing going on. The physiocrats, they weren't active until a century after this shift occurred in England. Nothing comes out of the Netherlands. Spain continued to be dominated by scholastic thought in this era, and the Germans, they developed a highly bureaucratized administrative science called cameralism, but that was focused on governance, not really economics, more policy-oriented. Really, it was England and eventually Scotland that developed the roots of classical economics. So what I want to do in this talk is explain why that is, why that was the case. Why did people begin writing about economics in such a fundamentally different way in this time and place? A crucial answer, or a crucial key to this answer, lies in who was actually writing the tracts. In the 16th century, most of the economic tracts were written by professionals, mainly authors and lawyers and the clergy. The great authors were people like Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas, ecclesiastics. In the 17th century, the great authors were merchants. Merchants increasingly picked up the pen and printed works on economics in the public sphere. As you can see in this table here. So here, this is some of the contributions that were made. Why did this happen? And here in this table, you can see here, if you look at the line here of merchants and the percentages, in the first year, this is a small numbers problem. There's so few texts written that you can get a really high percentage. But other than that, you can see it goes from a low 10% to a high of 38, where merchants are producing more text than anyone else. The merchants, they brought new habits of mind to their writing, an empirical bent, trade statistics that put a value on actually having experience in trade rather than knowledge of scripture. And they also had a need for legitimacy. Merchants were not highly valued in the medieval era and the sort of social stratification system of the time. The new early modern merchants and authors, they used, instead of the value of their reputation, they used logic and science as a crutch to shore up their arguments. I placed trade and finance at the center of economic concerns and moved away from the concerns of husbandry or the perils of sinful life that had obsessed earlier authors. So the question is, it sort of makes sense that merchants, if you have this new class of people writing new texts, that things would change, but there's still the question of why exactly would merchants start to write economic texts? I mean, in fact, they're sort of busy people. They have other concerns. Well, there's one thing that was happening in England that really got the merchants worked up. Queen Elizabeth had popularized the process of granting patents and monopolies to merchants. Huge new areas of trade were being awarded to nationally defined exclusive privileges to specific areas of the world. So certain groups of merchants were given exclusive rights to trade in specific areas. So some of my previous work, for example, was on the English East India Company, which was given exclusive privileges, just a small group of merchants, exclusive privileges from the trade from England to all across Asia, just huge, huge area. So some of these merchants were destined for huge profits in England, but some of the merchants were clearly cut out. And they needed to find new avenues for their livelihood. So this caused a lot of controversy between merchants. And they were very upset about it, right? So they had a motivation to write. But the controversy alone wasn't enough to stimulate new publications. The controversies had to arise in an institutional context that encouraged public debate. There probably could be a few different institutional configurations that would encourage this. But in England, it was the relative lack of power enjoyed by merchants in the government that was the sort of most important kind of stimulus to publishing works in the public sphere. Merchants had increasing economic power in the 17th century, but they had decreasing political power. They held a minority of parliamentary appointments that declined from 13% under Queen Elizabeth to around 9 to 7% in the mid-17th century. They were sparsely represented in the councils and boards of trade, and they were constantly complaining about how no one listened to their otherwise expert opinions on what should be done in trade and commerce. So this situation created what I've called, drawing on Ron Breiger and Mark Pachuki, a cultural hole, a gap in institutional logics, right? A gap between the company house here and the parliament, the offices or the floor of government. In Harrison White's terminology, he would call this a space, kind of a liminal space between institutions. In this case, between the state and the commercial world. The merchants desperately wanted to influence the state, so they invented a new language of economic discourse to try to influence the government into policies that would be favorable to their trade. Should there be a monopoly, for example? Should there not be a monopoly? Should gold be bought abroad? Should gold be shipped abroad, or foreign purchases banned? Serious economic questions that had serious implications for the merchants' livelihood. They wanted to enter in and convince the state of the validity of their position on these very specific policy points. The new economic discourse was the attempt of the merchants to bridge the gap between their new economic power and the political power of the state. In more mundane terms, they were making public appeals to try to sway the crown and parliament to take favorable positions on trade policy. And this added a crucial element to the economic thought they created. Instead of being cloaked in Christian values and morality, their works instead were reframed to appeal to politicians and rulers. So everything was posed in terms of how it affected the nation, the kingdom, and the commonwealth. Thus, the turn from equity and fair, just price to the more exclusive focus on the problem of growth and national development. So an analysis of the contents of the work supports this argument. And a lot of the book is going through, it tells the story, and then it provides a lot of different forms of evidence to show that this is in fact what was going on. Topic modeling and cluster analysis. This image is the result of topic modeling, where each of the circles is a different topic. I applied clustering analysis to that, and what you can see here in these there's 5 clusters that are produced, and they are 5 dominant sub-areas that occur within the larger economic discourse: politics, religion, husbandry, travel, and trade. This is the cluster analysis is based on the text creation partnership with Early English Books Online, which is 2,353 texts. I won't go into too much detail about, but what it does is essentially looks at the frequency of word co-occurrence and then groups different subsections of the text together. Those that are more similar are pushed closer together, and the clustering analysis reveals these themes. And then we can see a little bit about how the themes change over time. The orange is politics, yellow is religion, the dark green is trade, the light blue is travel, and the dark blue is husbandry. So now here's a chart of the most popular topic in the religious cluster, characterized by the frequent use, co-occurrence of the words man, well, honor, and the most popular topic in the trade cluster, characterized by frequent use of the words trade, England, and nation. So as you can see here, one declines. The most popular religious topic declines over the course of the 16th, 17th century, and trade, England, and nation just skyrockets towards the end here. A similar pattern you could see here for usury, lend, borrow, words often used to condemn usury in what we think of as sort of capital markets at this point. And we see here company interest of nation takes off and overtakes it in popularity over the course of the 17th century. If we move to the level of publications, see, right, so those were topics within publications. Here we're looking at just publications where each publication contributes a single data point. Then you can see that each of the 5 sub-areas, this one with the, unfortunately you can't see me pointing, but here I'll wave the arrow over it. This is trade. It clearly becomes dominant again by the end of the 17th century. If we move back to the prevalence of topics, we can get even more information and see that religious topics here, these are all the religious topics, and they largely decline over the years, where we see politics largely increase. Evidence here, this provides evidence of the way in which the economic topics are framed shifts from the moral and the spiritual to the national, the concerns of power and plenty, and the root of the importance of the idea of the wealth of nations lies in this shift. If we can step back a little bit now also and look not just at the contents, the themes and the kind of work, but at the rate of publications, we can see additional evidence of what was going on. So not only did the contents shift, but also just the number of economic works dramatically increased in this era. So this is a time series analysis of the publication of economic texts on an annual basis. So the solid line represents, let's see, here's just the straightforward sort of count, sorry. The solid line represents the number of companies that have been founded up to that year. And the dashed line represents, and there's different axes, the X, Y axis are different. So the number of, sorry, I had to adjust, I wanted to get in there. The axes. So sorry about that. So here's an image of the different economic texts that were published on an annual basis. So that's the dashed line. The solid line represents the number of companies that had been founded up to that year. I use a time series model to analyze the relationship between these two rates. And the time series model looks at the change of rates of the variables included. So it takes out any trends. It's just change from year to year. It's not a linear trend up. And I lag the publication of the books by 1 year to account for the time that it takes to publish something. And here, so the regression coefficients, we have companies, all texts, population, parliament days, like the effect of activity in the government, economic turmoil, just a year is a control, domestic politics, tax revenue, something the proxies government capacity, a rechartering of different companies, the existence of trades and councils of government on trade, commerce rates of commerce increasing or decreasing, over that being overseas trade, GDP, and the number of merchants in parliament. And the only two coefficients that have a significant predictive effect on the number of works in economics that are going to be published the next year are the number of companies that exist up to that point and the number of merchants in parliament. Where the more companies there are, the more likely it is that people will be publishing economic works, and the less representation merchants have in parliament, the more likely that there will be publications in economic texts. So these merchants are finding that they don't have a direct voice in government, and they need to go outside of those offices in order to make public appeals, bring more people into the conversation, and try to convince the government through their constituents to take certain sorts of actions. So it seems that when companies were founded, they spur the publication of economics books and pamphlets. And we see instances of this in the historical record as well. So for example, when the deregulation of the African slave trade came before Parliament, over 200 pamphlets were published on this topic. But the story, I think, really falls into place if you adopt also a comparative perspective. Many people thought that economic growth and the expansion of overseas trade triggered the development of economic theory. Others think that it was the rise of the state, it was the public sphere, representative government, or the creation of new financial techniques such as public debt. But if you ask, this is just focused on Europe, which is better for a comparison of this type because it controls for other possibly varying explanatory effects or other explanatory variables, because the England and the Dutch Republic are relatively similar in a lot of different ways, but they did vary on some crucial dimensions. But back in the 17th century, it really wasn't England that was at the forefront of the expansion of trade and overseas commerce. It was the Dutch Republic. The Dutch Republic was the most financially and commercially dynamic democracy of the 17th century. And yet, the Dutch have almost no economic publications, nothing like the boom in England. What they lacked, the crucial dimensions that were different, they had a representative government, they had a public sphere, they had a huge increase in overseas trade. What they lacked were the magnets of controversy, the chartered companies. The Dutch, they had only 4. The British companies, the 4, they were big companies, but there's only 4, and they were actually constituted in order to serve the public good. Whereas in Britain, there's hundreds of companies, and they're serving private interests. And the merchants also in the Dutch Republic, when the Dutch merchants wanted a policy change because of their leadership in Amsterdam and Amsterdam's pivotal role in the very complex governance structure of the Dutch Republic, the merchants had control of the government in the Dutch Republic. When they wanted to make a policy change, they enacted it. There was no need for them to go outside and make public appeals to the constituents. They were the ones in power. So this institutional configuration, the existent but restricted political power of the English merchants, combined with an impetus to debate, the chartered companies, then the impetus stimulated in England a vigorous new line of thought that ultimately provided an empirical and systematic foundation for classical economics. So it's now widely acknowledged that Adam Smith was not creating new observations about economic processes as much as systematizing existing theory. And the theory he was systematizing was the mercantilist economic thought developed in the 17th century. There's one very notable way that Adam Smith was different from his mercantilist predecessors. This was both, I would say, his greatest triumph and his greatest failure. Smith tried to reintroduce into economic thought the concern for equity that had characterized medieval scholastic economic theory. He brought back concern for fair exchange and the poorer classes. But these ideas, this was actually how he was least successful. They weren't able to infiltrate or overcome the new focus that the mercantilists had developed on national development at the expense of these other concerns. So I hope in revisiting this moment and the reasons why national economic development became so central to economic theory, that we might also reevaluate and perhaps reincorporate some of Smith's moral concerns for a system that's fair for all people. Okay, that's the end of the video. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. That's so fascinating. So we're going to transition into a time of Q&A. So for those of you guys that are joining us on Zoom, feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll move into that time of Q&A. You can either use the chat function on the bottom of your Zoom screen and enter the question, or even better, you can actually just raise your hand. Also, there should be a raise hand function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I will happily unmute you, and you can directly interact with Professor Erikson as well. And of course, since we are interacting in person, it's always great to be able to see the person that we're talking to. So those of you guys that are able to, it would be great if you could turn on your webcam, your video cam, so that we can be able to talk face to face in a sense, for those of you guys that are ready to ask questions. So feel free to ask questions anytime through the chat or using the raise hand function. I'll get started. I found this to be such an interesting topic, sort of pretty different, I think, than I think what most people usually think of when they think of sociology. You know, there's the history, there's the economics, and there's the data, kind of all rolled into one. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how did you sort of get interested in this topic, and how did you sort of decide that this would be worth thinking about and writing about, and obviously publishing a book about?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's two, I suppose, different levels upon which I can answer that question. One is just, you know, how I get interested in the topic. And the other is kind of, you know, why am I interested in historical settings, and which is unusual for sociology. I mean, I'll say, so I guess so I studied history, as I'll answer the second question first. I studied history as an undergraduate. And the program that I went into as a graduate student was pretty heavily invested in the idea of historical sociology, comparative historical sociology, but with a sort of a quantitative bent to it. So I think that's part of the reason they wanted me to come, actually. And the real benefit, and I think it's sometimes lost, but the real benefit of doing historical work is that a lot of changes take place over a long period of time. And a lot of things that are really important, like you might say, revolutions, regime change, you know, institutional creation, institutional erosion. These things, not only do they sometimes have very long-term determinants, but also they don't happen all the time. So from my perspective, I've always thought, if you want to understand what are the drivers of important, like consequential macro historical changes, you have to do historical research. That's your kind of laboratory. That's the library of things that happen. So, and those things are really important. You know, we don't want to just know what happens in a group of 2 or 3 people. We want to know what causes broad societal changes. So I think history is really the way to go, and hopefully also comparative historical research. So the reason, and then the more specific reason why I chose this topic is related to my first book. Really was on the English East India Company, and just something that really struck me as very strange while I was writing that book was the way that every single kind of important economic tract that I read about was somehow tied to one of the chartered companies in the era. And that just seemed to be such a strange thing to me, that these chartered companies would be producing so many influential tracks, and that they would be so tied to this kind of story of early mercantilism. And so it just seemed like one of those strange coincidences that I had to kind of dig deeper in to see what was really going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So you use, pretty interesting sources, I think historically, but also just sort of the data analysis that you do, and sort of how you sort of pluck data from all these different options that you could have chosen from. So could you maybe discuss a little bit more about sort of your methodology and how you sort of thought of using these different kind of techniques and ideas to do the analysis?
Sure. Well, I always think that a multi-method analysis is the right way to tackle these things. I mean, I never wanted to be sort of bound by, like people have the hammer and they use it on all objects. That doesn't. I mean, if you're really trying to solve a historical puzzle, then I don't think you want to be bound by using only one method, because it's going to certainly constrain the kinds of questions that you can successfully answer. So I generally try to do, certainly, like at base, a mix of qualitative and quantitative research. I mean, honestly, I think everyone should really be qualitative and quantitative at the same time, because the qualitative component gives you the context in which you can understand the quantitative analysis. So sometimes people can sort of get by with quantitative analysis without a lot of contextual research, just maybe because they know the context so well. So if you're doing, United States and, the late in the early 21st century, something that you don't have to provide a lot of context, but certainly in history, then you have to actually think about whether these things made sense in the same way that you assume they might. But I think as a rule, it's a good idea. And then the corpus analysis, the topic modeling, and I often do, and there's also some social network analysis in the book. Those things I think are really important also to understanding broad historical change, big sort of moments of transformation, because those moments aren't just about one person. There's never, I mean, even if it's one person that's writing a really important tract, that person, it doesn't matter unless there's a whole audience of people that are moved by that tract, or that find that it's really significant, or that implement it and put it into policy, or, so it's always a universe of different people that are creating these changes, almost by definition, because if they only impact one or two people, then it's actually not a broad historical social change. So the tools of the corpus analysis, rather than me having to focus on like 1 to 100 or 150 texts that I can really like read in detail. I mean, I read a lot of the text in detail anyways, but this lets me compare, like a pairwise comparison of, about like 3,000 texts, which is something that I just, none of us, it's not just me, like we don't have the brain capacity is just not there. We need computer assistance. And so these kinds of, I mean, pairwise comparisons of quite a lot of number of different comparisons. So they really, they broaden our ability, I would say, to think not just about a few specific examples that are always going to be kind of like cherry picked. I would say you can't really help it. Instead, we can think about whole populations and systemic change over time, which I just think is just crucial. We can't just ignore that. That's crucial if we want to understand broad social historical change. We have to at least consider that it's something that happens at the population level, not just a couple of people.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody has questions, feel free to ask them, raise your hand, or go ahead and enter them into the chat box. Otherwise, I can just keep talking with you.
I can say, I mean, I have the slides also. So if anyone has a question about a specific slide, I can put that back up. And let me also just apologize. I realized I must have had the paper on the microphone. So there's that rustling the whole time. So I wanted to just apologize for that.
That's quite all right. So this is a great opportunity for you guys to interact directly with Professor Erikson, of course, about anything in the presentation. You mentioned Adam Smith being more of somebody who just sort of, I guess in a way he was doing kind of what you're doing, right? Where he kind of just took everything that everybody was saying and sort of tried to figure out what was the important thing that was trying to be put across by the mercantile class. I find that very fascinating because I think, at least in the West, we're taught that he's this originator of a lot of these economic ideas. Can you, and you said it's pretty well established in the field now that he was more of somebody who was just kind of, taking everything and putting it into a systematic theory or what have you. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Sort of what the latest sort of historical analysis of that is, and sort of where we are with that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Adam Smith is a really, I would say, misunderstood figure, has been a misunderstood figure. So, it's not that he's not completely brilliant. I mean, I think he's just amazing, and this, the mercantilist literature, there's a lot of insights that are developed, and there's all this empirical work, but it was just very unorganized. It's just all over the place. There's all kinds of controversies. People, I mean, and if you read some of the books are, they're just not written in an organized fashion in the way that we're kind of used to. And, no citations, all those kinds of things. Like, so it's not, he's brilliant beyond this, but it's not a trivial fact to take all of this kind of ideas, theories, observations, and actually put them into a coherent form that could become the foundation for something like classical economics. So just that is quite sort of a feat, the fact that he's able to take this work and make it lay it out in a legible manner. But so he did do that, and there's work there, and then he really emphasized some of the underlying implications, like the division of labor and how this is beneficial for all parties involved. And the thing, so that's something that he's able to pull out from these works and emphasize, but it is also part of, I think, what his unique contribution. And the unique contribution is not so much, I would say, a specific observation about economic behavior or the laws of economics, but it's this other dimension to him, the moral philosophy dimension, which was, I think, more important to his identity, in fact, than the work on economics. So he's working on the theory of moral sentiments on his deathbed, but he wasn't, still working on the wealth of nations. But the moral dimension, I mean, if you, just the idea of the division of labor as being beneficial for all nations that take part in that. It's a very strong moral statement about what's good and positive, and what brings prosperity is good for all people. I mean, so there's this just really important and far-thinking aspect to his work. I think he tried to introduce a rationale for doing good work, for caring for others, an economic rationale. And again, that's I mean, when he's talking about the wealth of nations, also, like, he was defining, and again, this is all pretty well supported by other scholars like Martha Nussbaum and other people that are working on him right now. He's not just talking about the nation in the sense of the ruler, the king, the queen, the monarch, or the parliament, or or the wealthy classes. He's talking about the entire nation, the body of people, the body of people that make up the country, most of which are poor, right? Because most of the people certainly then and even now, like most of the people don't have very much money. It's only a small number of people that have, most of the wealth in the nation. So he's talking about building up the wealth of mostly of the people that are currently the impoverished class, and trying to demonstrate, the benefits that will have for all of society, even the people that have more money. And that's so that's really important. That's really different. That's quite different from what the mercantilists were doing. They were very pretty self-interested, and they were trying to advocate for specific policy changes that would just help them. Adam Smith is an entirely sort of different class that way. But unfortunately, as probably everyone knows from the legacy that unfolded over, most of the 20th centuries, he's like known for the opposite, for some kind of, weird laissez-faire, sort of not Darwinian, but like Spencerian fight, survival of the fittest, kind of like everyone do whatever, like free for all market competition, which is just not, if you read The Wealth of Nations, and then certainly if you read the sentiments, it's just a mischaracterization of his work. It's like a gross mischaracterization. It's so strange, in fact, that it was it's like such a strong image in the popular consciousness that seems so far removed from what is actually in his books. It's puzzling. I don't know. I hope someone writes a book about that, about why Adam Smith was mischaracterized for the past, 120 years.
Yeah, I was just going to say that sounds like a great next book project there. It looks like we have Ella asking a question here. Ella?
Hi, Professor.
Hi.
I'm a high school student, and I plan to study economics as my future major, and I want to study in Yale University too. So now I'm planning to study some AP courses like microeconomics. So can I ask for some advice of learning this subject?
Sure. Specific advice, or was that just the question?
During the learning process, I think I have some difficulties, like I cannot remember the definition very well. So I think I need to maybe read more books or do something to improve the situation.
Oh, yeah, I think, so I'm not really an expert on learning. I have to say, maybe there's other people that certainly study that process directly, not, but what I could say is that I think, you build up a kind of a universe, a network. I think of things often in network terms, a network of concepts and in terms and ideas, and that the kind of more dense the connections are between those different ideas and words and concepts is, the easier it is for you to kind of to connect to them, to recall them based on the other ideas. So I think that the plan of reading a lot of books, and I would say don't worry too much about trying to fix any one particular book in your mind. Just read broadly, and then you build up this kind of universe of connections, and it becomes easier to recall things over time. So mostly don't worry, and don't give yourself anxiety about remembering any one thing. Just keep working and broadening your universe, and things will fall into place.
That's
okay.
Great. Thank you, Elle. Next, we have Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi. So I have a question, because I read Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, and well, the part I liked most was on his the standing army arguments, which were pretty interesting. But I wanted to ask like the whole of his arguments and those before him and after him, for example, the commercial class, them suggesting like proposals on how policies should change, etc. Like, what did his age and these times meant for like the balance and dynamic of like equality and economic growth and prosperity? Like, what is the dynamic between like these two like different aspects, and do they like reinforce each other, or do they compete, or like how do they work during that specific period?
So you're specifically asking Adam, so I just want to rephrase so I completely understand that question. So how did Adam Smith's, the kind of ideology or his ideas, his recommendations affect rates of equality in society?
Like how his theories like demonstrate or reflect like the balance or dynamics of equality and social growth and prosperity, or just economic growth in a sense. Like how do
Okay.
these,
I think
for
I see
example, like balance
so,
each other out?
right. So, I mean, one of the interesting things about Adam Smith, so did it reflect increasing equality or the rise of the mercantilist? I mean, so you have the rise of merchants. It is, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're getting at, but there has been, I mean, so Adam Smith, some people say, oh, Adam Smith, he's writing this, he's creating a discourse of economics that explains what's going on in England at this time, right? So England is experiencing greater economic success, and he's just kind of like, the economic success, it's a different sort of theory of what drives economic theory than what I've proposed. And that's that it's just like increasing economic growth, increasing economic complexity kind of calls forth more complex theories that you need it in order to just sort of explain what people are observing on the ground. But, you know, so, I mean, Adam Smith, the division of labor, he's talking about factory production, but it is before the Industrial Revolution. So it's not like he's commenting on the Industrial Revolution. It happens prior to, and England, so by 1787, England's in a much better position than it had been in the 17th century. But when the merchants, again, when the merchants are developing the theories that he's going to be systematizing, you know, I mean, England it's definitely not clear that England is going to be the sort of imperial hegemon of the globe at this point. Like that would be, and it's really not clear, especially when you begin to take in the comparison with Asia, that the economic growth in England or in Europe was ahead of what was happening in China and in the Indian subcontinent. I mean, those were places of real sort of, you know, commercial efflorescence. And I mean, so one of the funny things always about the English East India Company, for me, the history is that, you know, they exported bullion, which is one of the kind of like contentious points that people argued over and ended up producing a lot of printed texts about. The reason they exported bullion is because no one in Asia had any interest in buying any goods from England, because the goods are just sort of like poor quality, you know. They had the wool, they wanted to sell wool, and people, they were like, we don't want wool. And then the only people that ended up buying the wool were the Mughals, and they just use it for their horse blankets because it wasn't, you know, very high quality. So in terms of like economic development, just producing it, like in the comparative perspective, it just doesn't seem like it's a plausible explanation, because other parts of the world would have been developing these kinds of thoughts and texts if it was just about economic growth, economic complexity. Does that answer the question, or was there another dimension I'm sort of missing?
I think I actually, I think that's pretty cool, because economic growth and development, I think, is one of the things that Smith wanted to address, at least in part. And like, what do all these, because at that time, I believe the English like class differentiations were, at least to an extent, very relevant to their times. For example, like the merchant class and the commercial classes, and what do these like class differentiations, and if we could call it like an inequality, like what does this have to do with, for example, like economic growth, or does it have a correlation to economic growth? Like, how do these like two factors like interact, like during that specific times?
Well, so it's an interesting question. I mean, I'm better positioned to say how the kind of class structure impacted not economic growth itself, but the growth of economic thought, right? So I can say, for example, that the merchants, it is important that the merchants are an aspiring class. And it's important that in terms of the social stratification system of the time, that they're, I mean, in a sense, this is like a very different position than you would get from sort of a classical Marxist take, where the classic Marxist take is, oh, the merchants assume political power, and then they became able to kind of voice their ideology as the kind of central state ideology, and sort of like, you know, the false truth or something like that. But that's very different from what I'm saying, where I'm saying they were kept outside of the state, right? So they didn't have the political power. They couldn't just use the state as their mouthpiece. And in fact, it was like a little bit more the opposite. They had to have some power and resources. Otherwise, it's hard to make these kinds of arguments, but they're trying to reach the state. So they're trying to bridge the gap. So it's because they're lower class. They're not like the lowest class, but they're not upper class. They're in the middle, and not given a lot of legitimacy or respect by the entire society. Right? I mean, just recall that we're barely out of the medieval era. Money and commerce is generally considered to be a sin. Money is evil. Merchants are sort of like the lowest of the low in some ways, morally speaking. So it's because the merchants had all of these problems with legitimacy, that they're not able to gain political power. That's exactly why they turned to this practice of actually writing texts and trying to convince other people that they're actually right. So it's because they don't have political power that they make the public arguments. There's this great work by an old political scientist, Schattenschneider, and he always talks about with a fight, like if you're in a fight, if you're losing, what you want to do is bring more people into the fight to change the balance of power. And that's exactly the strategy here, is you're bringing in a larger number of people into this argument, trying to sort of change the balance of power so that you could get some leverage. That's how I would see the class structure of the merchants really mattering. Even more so, or like another kind of interesting wrinkle to this is that because they had so little legitimacy in the larger population, they began to rely on this new idea of a scientific approach, a logical and empirical approach. So they couldn't sort of make claims like, oh, well, you know, I'm a good man, and no one really believed that. So then they had to make claims based on some kind of external logic, and they turned to this new thing that was developing at the time. Francis Bacon is starting to be active. The Royal Society of London is being formed, and so this they use as kind of a rhetorical tool. Lucky for us, because just using science and logic and empirics as a rhetorical tool turns out has kind of long-standing effects, and can discipline people into actually becoming more logical, more scientific, and more empirical.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really interesting how merchants, they try to influence the state, whereas before, like, their power is very little. Yeah, thanks, very interesting.
No, great question.
All right, thanks so much, Professor.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm curious, you know, we're talking about the mercantile class as if they were just some homogenous sort of, you know, group thinking the same thing. Like, you know, as you've looked at some of the literature, is there a sense that there's sort of competing views or different views, or just sort of different nuances? You know, to what extent are they sort of arguing for the same exact thing, and to what extent is it like oh, I have this idea that's better, or maybe this is what we should be pushing?
Oh yeah, no, they're a very diverse and varied group of people. And so the biggest cleavage, I mean, I'd say there's cleavages, right? So there's still difference, but there's cleavages. And the biggest in that time is between the people that were within the companies and had some kind of monopoly privileges and the people that were not within companies. And so those people are constantly arguing about whether or not monopoly privileges should exist, whether there should be free trade. And it's interesting because it's a very different way of thinking about free trade than we have now, where free trade is usually the government. Well, then the government was actively involved in suppressing free trade, right? So and now we're sort of, people say like, we want free trade, but the government sort of like has to set the conditions to create the free trade. But so it's definitely pretty different in terms of what's going on and the kind of government interventions that are occurring. I mean, now the government breaks up monopolies, then the government constructed monopolies, like essentially. So the free trade, the free traders are one group of merchants, and then the monopolists are another group of merchants. I mean, a lot of them had very specific, it's so interesting. They had there's people in guilds, there's these two guilds that fought all the time. One did brown bread and one did white bread, and they would fight over like which type of, like, is the bread rye, like, is that brown or white, like, what's the classification? So there's tons and tons of different sort of petty arguments that occur between the merchants, but they all wanted more attention. They all, they generally agreed on the principles that merchants were not given enough power or influence when it came to how the government ran trade and commercial policy.
Great, thanks. Ronald?
Dear professor, when we focus on the economical events, is it possible for us to make a general conclusion just through several events or several people? Or in some special situation, the more is different? And thanks for your time.
Sorry, I need a little more help with that question. So the macroeconomic, could you repeat that, Donald? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm Ronald.
I mean, it is possible for us to make a general conclusion just only through several events or several people. Can we use this conclusion to have a general conclusion on other events? Just several events.
So is this sort of generalizable to other circumstances? Is that the question?
Yep.
Is it? So, I mean, that's a very difficult, I would say. So I kind of think in terms of mechanisms, social mechanisms. And I think that, social mechanisms are portable, like you can pull them out of a certain historical context and see them in another historical context, and they tend to work the same way. But I would say, that the outcome can be slightly different given the historical context and the situation that they're in, right? So, if you have a sieve and you use it to strain some kind of a liquid, it's going to work roughly the same way across whatever liquid you use, but what you catch is going to differ varied on the characteristics of the liquid itself, right? So tools, they work differently in different contexts. And I think this is similar to what's you might observe here, is that I do think, for example, that if you get this kind of disjuncture between groups, that as we see between the merchants, it's like aspiring merchant class and the state, that probably, these kinds of disjunctures actually produce new kinds of writing, thought, and knowledge. Like they produce visible knowledge, because when you pull groups apart, they have to communicate to one another, right? And the communication.
Mm.
So that's actually, it's actually difference that requires communication, translation, new modes of thought, new modes of expression. So I think that that's something general, like, and public, especially public knowledge, is something that is going to be created when there's groups that are kind of interacting in a political arena. That's my sort of understanding of what's going on there in terms of a generalizable process. Of course, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of discourse is produced is going to vary greatly depending upon the specific historical circumstances, and the traits of the groups and what their interests are. So some things are going to vary, but I do think that some things there's sort of the larger abstract form of the social process is probably something that we could see reoccurring in other places.
Okay, I understand. Thanks for your time.
Oh, thank you, Ronald. That great question.
Okay. Mm.
Great, thank you, Ronald. And next we have Beatrice.
Thank you. Professor, I have a question regarding that, people always say that history will repeat itself. But with the development of the technology, it reshaped our mindset and it reshaped our society. The future of the history will go. So my question is, our history will repeat itself in the future.
Will history repeat itself in the future? Well, I mean, so it's interesting because this is sort of like a very similar question to Ronald's question, in fact, right? I mean, so, you can think about it across context, across, so I think, again, it's a similar answer. I think history can repeat itself in the sense of, you can get a sort of sense of the general contours or trends or what the mechanism might be, but that predicting like the more specific outcome is a lot more difficult. So I would say, I mean, I think some things like we see later in the 20th century, things like chemistry, the field of chemistry is like kind of produced through an interaction between the dyeing industry and changing the colors, like the dyeing and the political sector. So there are these these different moments where there's kinds of interactions across actors, and then they produce knowledge. And there's a great paper, I think, by John Moore and Harrison White. Harrison White was my dissertation committee, just incredible mentor, one of the founders of social network analysis. And they have an argument that if you have a new population of actors that are entering into some kind of a discourse setting, that it's going to generate a new way of thinking about things. Like they produce innovation as long as you get this new set of people. And those kinds of things, I think, are probably constant. I mean, human nature, I don't think human nature changes that much, but technology does change and context changes and sort of habits change. Some things about culture change. So the things work themselves out in different ways. But I do think that you can get a really good intuitive sense about how things will work out from understanding the kinds of mechanisms and structural components that often guide our behavior in ways that, we can't really escape. It'd be just, like if you think about social network analysis, diffusion, epidemics, and contagion, like I think that we learned a lot during the pandemic about the ways that social interaction, whether we intended to or not, has certain effects. And there's certain patterns of social interactions that lead to more contagion and some that lead to less contagion. And it doesn't really matter what the virus is. It's, it's just, it's sort of something that has to do with the formal properties of human behavior. So in that sense, I think so we can roughly kind of think about what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, so the fundamental behavior pattern of people will remain the same, but the way we do things, the way we think about things will change. But fundamentally, what we are the same as the people in the earlier history. So it's right.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest, like I don't see that much change. If you look at it at a superficial level, you're like, what are those crazy people doing? It's so weird. Like they have those crazy names that, the whole society and they did awful things, and like people are discriminated against in horrible ways. But if you read like a journal, or I don't know, I mean, I always think when I read St. Augustine's Confessions, I don't know if I've, I mean, that's from quite a while ago, right? We're talking thousands and thousands of years. He just sounds like a person. I mean, it doesn't read like an alien. It reads like a very thoughtful individual that could be living today. I mean, so I don't know. To me, I feel like human nature hasn't changed very much.
Okay, I got it. Thank you, Professor.
Oh, sure, Beatrice. Thank you.
All right, I think we're at a good place in terms of time to stop. Thank you again, Professor Erikson, for joining us despite your accident, and we're very glad to see that you've recovered well. It is our tradition that at the end that everybody can turn on their camera so we can take a group picture of sorts.
Oh, that's nice.
Yes, a semblance of being able to gather together somewhat. So if people are able to, and please turn on your webcams so that we can have a group picture with Professor Erikson. And then I'll also unmute everybody so that everybody can thank you personally for taking the time to talk with us.
Thank you so much for, everyone coming. It's really a pleasure. And I hope at some point in the future I can meet you all in person.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And there we go. Yep. Thank you. And have a good evening for those of you that are in Beijing.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Professor.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for
so much
coming.
for coming.
Bye-bye.